There was a boy who sat alone in a small room every single evening, surrounded by nothing but a dim lamp, a worn notebook, and the kind of silence most people spend their whole lives running from. No television, no conversation, no background noise. Just him, his thoughts, and a decision he had made at the age of 14 that most adults around him could not understand. He had decided to train his mind the way others train their bodies. He did not know the science behind what he was doing. He did not have a mentor to guide him. What he had was a quiet conviction that if he could learn to control where his attention went, he could control where his life went. What happened next changed everything about the person he became, and it will change how you see your own mind too. We live in a world that is constantly pulling us in 1,000 directions at once. Every notification, every headline, every scroll through a feed is a small but deliberate grab for your attention. And attention, as scientists and philosophers have come to understand, is not just a tool for getting things done. It is the very substance of your life. What you give your attention to is what your life becomes. The ancient Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journals that the soul becomes dyed by the color of its thoughts. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was pointing at something that modern neuroscience has since confirmed in remarkable detail. Your brain literally reshapes itself around the things you focus on repeatedly. Every hour of sustained concentration builds stronger neural pathways, and every hour of fragmented attention weakens them. The boy's name was Daniel. He grew up in a modest household in a mid-sized city where ambition was not discouraged, but it was not encouraged either. His father worked long hours in a factory, and his mother stretched every dollar she had to keep the family together. There were no tutors, no enrichment programs, no extra resources of any kind. What Daniel had was a library card and a deep restlessness that never quite let him settle. He was not the best student in his school. He was not the worst. He was somewhere in the middle, an invisible child whom teachers forgot the moment they turned to the whiteboard. But inside his own mind, something was already different about him. He had begun to notice, at an age when most children never think about such things, that the quality of his thinking changed depending on how distracted he was. Quiet produced clarity. Noise produced confusion. This was not philosophy to him. It was just something he had felt over and over until it became undeniable. At 14, Daniel made his rule. Every evening after dinner, he would spend 1 full hour in deliberate silence, working on a single task of his choosing with no interruptions and no distractions of any kind. It sounds simple. It sounds almost too ordinary to matter. But the first time he tried it, he lasted 11 minutes before getting up to get a glass of water he did not actually need. The second night, he made it to 19 minutes. The third night, he failed entirely and spent the hour watching television with his family. He did not give up. He did not catastrophize his failures. He treated each evening as a fresh attempt, and he kept a small notebook where he wrote down exactly how long he had managed to hold his concentration before the pull of distraction won. This simple act of tracking his own attention was not something he read in a book. It was something he invented on his own, and it would turn out to be one of the most powerful mental training habits a human being can adopt. Psychologists call what Daniel was building something called attentional control. It is the capacity to voluntarily direct and sustain your focus despite the presence of competing stimuli. Research shows that attentional control is not a fixed trait people are born with. It is a skill developed through practice that strengthens over time in the same way that muscles respond to resistance training. In a landmark study from the University of Wisconsin, participants who underwent 8 weeks of mindfulness-based attention training showed measurable changes in the thickness of the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain most responsible for planning, decision-making, and sustained concentration. The brain is not a static organ. It is a living, adaptive system that reorganizes itself based on the demands placed upon it. What Daniel was doing in that small dim room was not wasted time. He was doing neuroscience without knowing it. By the time Daniel was 16, he could hold his concentration for 90 uninterrupted minutes. He had moved from single tasks to harder ones. He was no longer just reading or practicing math. He was writing, solving complex logic puzzles, and teaching himself basic programming for a library book that was 3 editions out of date. His grades had begun to improve, not because he was working more hours than his classmates, but because the hours he worked were of an entirely different quality. There is a concept in performance science called deep work, popularized in academic research on expertise before it became widely discussed in the productivity community. It refers to professional activity performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that pushes your cognitive capabilities to their limit. This kind of work creates new value, improves your skill, and is increasingly rare in a world designed to fragment your attention at every turn. Daniel did not have a name for it yet, but he was living it. What most people do not realize is that the battle for focus is not primarily a battle against external distractions. It is a battle against a very specific process happening inside your own brain. Neuroscientists have identified a neural network called the default mode network. It activates whenever your attention is not actively locked onto an external task. It is responsible for mind-wandering, daydreaming, self-referential thinking, and the endless internal narrative most of us experience as our baseline mental state. The default mode network is not a flaw. It serves important functions, including memory consolidation, empathy, and creative problem solving. But when it dominates your waking hours, it prevents the kind of deep, directed attention that leads to mastery. The most impressive performers in any field have learned, consciously or not, to quiet that internal narrator and stay present in their work. This is what flow researchers have been studying for decades. The concept of flow was first formally described by psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi after he spent years interviewing high performers across dozens of fields, from chess grandmasters to surgeons, from athletes to jazz musicians. What he found was that the most fulfilling and productive moments in people's lives shared a common structure. There was a task that was challenging enough to demand full engagement, but not so overwhelming that it produced panic. There was a clear goal and immediate feedback, and there was a quality of absorption so complete that time seemed to bend, self-consciousness disappeared, and action flowed without effort or hesitation. Csikszentmihalyi described the human mind as capable of processing approximately 110 to 120 bits of information per second. When a task fully consumes that capacity, there is simply no room left in consciousness for worry, self-doubt, or distraction. You are too busy being excellent to be afraid. Daniel discovered flow accidentally during the winter of his junior year in high school. He had been working on a particularly difficult programming problem for an evening session, and somewhere around the 40-minute mark, something shifted. He looked up from a notebook, and 3 hours had passed. He had no memory of feeling tired, hungry, or bored. He had solved the problem, written 12 pages of notes, and felt more rested than he had after sleeping. He described it later, as a grown man, as the moment he understood what his mind was truly capable of. He said it was like discovering a room inside a house you had lived in your whole life, a room that had always been there, but that no one had ever told you how to open. He chased that feeling for years after, and chasing it made him extraordinary. Not everyone is born into circumstances that naturally support the development of focus. In fact, research consistently shows that chronic stress, poverty, and instability actively impair the brain's capacity for sustained attention. The prefrontal cortex, which governs focused thought and executive function, is among the brain regions most sensitive to stress hormones like cortisol. Children who grow up in chaotic, unpredictable environments often develop nervous systems that are calibrated for survival rather than concentration. Because in those environments, constant alertness is an advantage and sustained focus is a vulnerability. This makes what Daniel was building even more remarkable. He was not working with the wind at his back. He was building the architecture of a focused mind in conditions that made such building genuinely difficult, and he was doing it entirely through the force of a decision he made at 14 years old and never fully abandoned. By the time Daniel graduated high school, he had received a partial scholarship to a state university, not because he was the most naturally gifted student in his class, but because his application essays and his project work demonstrated a depth of thinking that stood apart. His professor in his first-year computer science course pulled him aside after the third week and asked him how he had learned to break problems down the way he did. Daniel told him the truth. He said he had practiced sitting still with hard things until the hard things stopped feeling impossible. The professor did not know what to make of that answer at first, but he never forgot it. He would quote it in lectures for years afterward, telling students that the ability to stay with difficulty long enough to understand it is one of the rarest and most valuable capacities a human being can develop. He was right. Every field of human endeavor, from medicine to music to mathematics, is ultimately a test of that capacity. There is something important that gets lost in conversations about success, productivity, and high performance. People talk endlessly about strategy, about habits, about morning routines, and goal-setting frameworks. And while none of those things are useless, they all miss something that sits deeper. They miss the fact that none of those tools work without the foundational ability to place your full, undivided, sustained attention on the thing in front of you and keep it there. Strategy without focus is just a plan you will never execute. Habits without attention become mindless repetition. Goals without concentration are wishes dressed up in the language of ambition. The one variable that consistently separates people who reach their potential from those who do not is not intelligence, not talent, not even work ethic in the conventional sense. It is the quality of their attention. It is the willingness to go deep. Daniel is in his mid-30s now. He built a small technology company that solves infrastructure problems for organizations in the healthcare sector. He is not famous. He is not a billionaire. He does not have a best-selling book or a podcast with millions of subscribers. What he has is a life shaped so thoroughly by intentional attention that the people who work with him describe him in almost identical terms, regardless of whether they have known him for a week or a decade. They say he listens differently. They say when he is thinking about something, you can feel the quality of the concentration in the room. They say his ideas do not come fast, they come right. He still keeps notebooks. He still protects his mornings for his hardest thinking. And he still practices the discipline he started at 14, not out of obligation, but because he has tasted what the mind can do when it is fully awake and fully committed, and nothing else compares to that. The story of Daniel is not meant to be a story about a special person. It is meant to be a mirror, because the truth is that every human brain carries the same fundamental architecture, the same default mode network, the same prefrontal cortex, the same capacity for flow, the same susceptibility to distraction. The difference between a life built on depth and a life spent on the surface is not fixed at birth. It is chosen again and again in small moments that accumulate over years into something unmistakable. It is chosen every time you resist the pull of the easy option and stay with the difficult thing long enough to understand it. It is chosen every time you protect a block of your day for the work that genuinely matters and guard that block like it belongs to you, because it does. The hour you spend in deep, undivided focus on something meaningful is one of the most powerful investments a human being can make. Not in productivity, in the person you are becoming.